Something very strange happened in 1916. Margaret found proof that other people who were looking for something had left messages for each other at different times. In certain rooms, there were sequences of symbols carved into stone that acted as a kind of communication across time. Margaret spent weeks figuring out what these messages meant, knowing that each seeker had added their own piece of information to the growing body of knowledge, which helped her understand the mystery they all shared better. She started adding her own messages by carving symbols into the stone with metal tools. She combined what she had learned with what the voices taught her, knowing that someday, maybe in decades or centuries, another seeker would find her words and continue the work. The mansion above the basement was now hard to tell apart from the natural ruins that were scattered throughout the mountains. The walls had completely fallen down, leaving only the outlines of the original building. The basement, on the other hand, was still standing and seemed even stronger than before, as if it had been strengthened by something other than normal engineering. Margaret had turned the basement door into a fancy portal, with patterns and symbols that could either be a warning or an invitation, depending on who saw them. For most people, those signs would make them feel uneasy and want to turn away. But for the next seekers who would eventually hear the voices and be called, those signs would be an irresistible beacon. Margaret now knew that her journey was coming to a change. Not an end, but a change of state. The voices had become such a part of her mind that she couldn't tell if she was still a separate person or if she had become part of something bigger and less defined. Sometimes it felt like her thoughts were echoing through the tunnels before she had fully formed them, as if the tunnels were starting to think for her. It was both freeing and scary to feel the lines between herself and others, and between herself and the place she lived, slowly fade away. The Appalachian heiress, Margaret Burke, was changing into something more and something less. This change would take her to places that even the voices couldn't fully describe. In the summer of 1917, the mountains were eerily quiet, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Margaret had changed so much that the difference between day and night no longer made sense to her. She was always aware of what was going on around her, and sleep and waking up were the same thing. The tunnels felt like they were part of her body. Each chamber was a memory, and each passage was a thought. She could feel the whole underground structure as if it were her own nervous system spreading through the living rock. The voices had stopped talking, not because they had left, but because they weren't needed anymore. Margaret now understood directly, without needing words or ideas to help her. She just knew. She knew when to open new doors, when to arrange crystals in certain ways, and when to stay still in deep meditation so that the energies of the place could flow through her. She had become a kind of priestess for a nameless cult, performing rituals that had no basis in any known human tradition, but that came about naturally from the very sacred geography of those depths. The Burke estate's reputation went beyond just local superstition. People who traveled through the area said they had strange experiences even miles away, like compasses spinning wildly, clocks stopping or speeding up for no reason, and a constant feeling of being lost that made familiar paths seem strange. It was as if the estate had a gravitational pull that was both physical and perceptual, bending the space around it in ways that people could see but not fully understand. Margaret started to see time patterns that didn't follow the usual linear path. There were times when she was in rooms she didn't remember going to, but she knew she had put things there. Or she found notes in her own notebooks that she didn't remember writing, but they were definitely in her handwriting. It felt like different versions of herself, living at different times, were working together on a project that went beyond linear time. In the depths of those tunnels, past and future were intertwined, creating causal loops that made effects come before causes. In one of the oldest rooms, which had the central crystalline altar, Margaret started to do something that could only be called performances. There was no one there to see them, but it was as if she were playing a part in a cosmic drama with people from other dimensions that she could only vaguely see. The voices had taught her how to move in choreographed patterns, and her gestures made shapes in the air that seemed to last for a few seconds after her hands had moved, like glowing trails left by a moving light source captured on long exposure. On some nights, the strange things that happened around the property got worse. People saw lights not only in the basement windows, but also floating among the trees, moving in complicated geometric patterns before suddenly disappearing. Sounds that couldn't be traced back to any natural source echoed through the mountains. These strange harmonies made people feel both attracted and repelled, fascinated and scared at the same time. The line between the Burke property's physical location and some other kind of space was becoming less and less clear. Margaret started to see things that weren't really hallucinations, but rather layers of reality that usually stayed hidden. She didn't just see mountains as rocks. She saw them as living things with their own breathing cycles that lasted thousands of years. She saw that trees were connected by underground chemical networks that let them talk to each other about threats and resources. She didn't think of weather patterns as random events. She thought of them as signs of complex systems reacting to small changes. She was just starting to get it. The world was much more complicated and connected than any philosophy or science of the time could explain. By normal standards, Margaret's body had changed so much that it was hard to tell that she was human. Her posture had changed to fit perfectly in the small spaces of the tunnels. Her movements were smooth and seemed to go beyond what joints and muscles can normally do. There were times when her body didn't seem as solid as it should have. It was as if she were made of the same strange stuff as the shadows that danced on the walls. She was now a creature that lived on the edge of the material and the immaterial, the human and the elemental. In 1918, Margaret finished what would be her last big project that could still be called human. She linked all the main rooms with a series of perfectly aligned channels, making what was essentially a huge musical instrument. When the wind blew through the surface openings at certain angles, it pushed air through these tunnels, which made deep, resonant sounds that made the whole structure shake. It was a geological symphony, not written down in the usual way, but by physically changing the underground structures. The notebooks that Margaret kept had become powerful things in their own right. She had collected minerals and crystals and put them on the pages, making texts that were both written documents and ritual objects. Some of the notebooks glowed softly in the dark. This was because she had found phosphorescent compounds in deep chambers. Some were heavier than the paper should have allowed, as if they had more mass than could be seen. And there was one that Margaret always kept close by. It felt warm to the touch and made a sound that was almost too quiet to hear when held for too long. Margaret knew that she was getting close to the end. All the planning, changes, and rituals were parts of a bigger process that was now coming to an end. The voices had talked about this convergence years before, and it was finally happening. A perfect alignment of earthly and heavenly factors that would create a one-of-a-kind chance. Margaret didn't know exactly what would happen when this convergence happened, but she could feel it coming, like the pressure before a huge storm. She had spent years getting to this point, completely changing herself along the way. Now, everything depended on her being able to stay present and open when the moment came, deep inside an Appalachian mountain that held secrets older than any human civilization. There was a clear change in the air around the Appalachian Mountains in the fall of 1919. Margaret Burke, or what was left of her, felt the convergence coming with a certainty that went beyond any kind of rational knowledge. It was like every cell in her body and every thought in her mind were tuned to a certain frequency that was getting stronger and stronger. The tunnels around her were full of hidden energy. The stone walls seemed to glow from within, and the crystals in the deep chambers made harmonic sounds that formed intricate melodies without anyone touching them. For weeks, Margaret got ready by going back to each room, checking every symbol carved into the walls, and moving crystals with millimeter precision. She had learned that even the smallest change in any part could have a big effect on the convergence. The voices, which had been quiet for a long time, came back every now and then to give final advice. But this time they spoke in a different tone, almost reverent, as if they were also impressed by how big what was about to happen was. Margaret knew that she wasn't just a part of this event. She was a vital part of it, like a cog in a cosmic machine that would only work if all the pieces were in the right place. The Burke estate had become something that couldn't be put into a box. It was no longer just a ruined mansion or a network of tunnels. It was a portal, a place where the rules that govern the rest of the world began to break down and give way to completely new ones. Visitors coming up would feel this right away, a deep sense of disorientation that went beyond the physical and mental. They would feel that the very structure of reality was different there, more fluid, more malleable, and more open to possibilities that would be impossible elsewhere. Margaret's episodes of expanded perception began to happen more often. At these times, she wasn't just in her body. She was also in the whole network of tunnels, experiencing multiple chambers and points of view at the same time. She could feel the flow of water underground through cracks that weren't visible. See how slowly the rock plates were moving to adjust to the huge pressure, and sense the presence of certain minerals through meters of solid rock. It was like she had become the mountain itself, with her mind spreading through every crack and hole, going beyond what makes a person a person. Even the most die-hard skeptics couldn't ignore the strange things happening around the property anymore. Not only did lights float among the trees, but they also made intricate geometric patterns in the night sky that could be seen for minutes before fading away. At certain times, strange sounds echoed through the mountains, like an acoustic countdown to the coming together, and there were reports of people in villages miles away having the same dream at the same time. Tunnels that went on forever, a glowing figure walking toward something that shone at the edge of darkness, and a feeling that it was going to happen no matter what. Margaret paid extra attention to the central chamber, which had the crystal altar in it. She changed the whole setup, making concentric circles of things she had gathered over the years, like crystals of certain shapes, pieces of rare minerals, and even some things that other seekers had left behind. Margaret put each object in exactly the right spot, using calculations she made while in deep meditation, where numbers and symbols mixed in a way that went beyond any formal system of math. The end result was a three-dimensional mandala, a pattern that acted like an antenna or lens, bringing together energies that would normally be spread out and invisible. Margaret's notebooks were now full. The last one had clear directions for anyone who might want to go there in the future. She had written in a number of languages, some of which she was aware of and others that just came out of her hand without her fully understanding what they meant. There were diagrams showing how the stars lined up, maps of the tunnels with notes on important chambers, and sequences of symbols that acted as keys to unlock deeper meanings. Margaret put this last notebook in a metal box and buried it in a second room. She marked its location with symbols that only someone with the right sensitivity could see. The last part of Margaret's change had happened. Her skin had gotten so thin that the glowing veins beneath it were visible, pulsing with a light that was not blood, but something more basic. Her eyes didn't reflect light anymore. Instead, they absorbed it, making it look like they were gateways to an endless darkness. Her movements were completely silent, as if she were no longer moving through the physical world in the usual way, but rather gliding through it like a projection. And there were times when, if someone were watching, they would think she had just disappeared, blending in with the shadows around her and then appearing again somewhere else. There was no big warning before the night of convergence, but Margaret knew. She could feel it, The exact moment when the stars and planets were in the right places, when the deep, telluric currents beneath the mountains were in the right shape, and when everything else that needed to happen happened at the same time. As Margaret walked slowly to the central chamber, she passed through tunnels that glowed with a natural phosphorescence, as if the rock itself were alive. There was a deep hum in the background that sounded like it came from the center of the earth. The air was charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. When Margaret walked into the main room, everything was just as she had planned. The crystals arranged in concentric circles shone brighter and brighter, each vibrating at a different frequency that combined with the others to make a stunningly complex visual and sound symphony. Margaret stood in the exact middle of the altar she had worked so hard to set up. She closed her eyes, not because she had to, but as part of a ritual, and started to say sounds that weren't quite words, but were more like vibrations shaped by the human voice into patterns that matched the basic frequencies of the place. The answer came right away and was too much to handle. Not like an earthquake, but with a controlled and precise resonance. The whole chamber started to shake. The walls looked like they were going to be see-through for a short time, showing layers of reality that are usually hidden. Margaret could see through the rocks, the mountains, and even the ground itself to the magma currents that were flowing deep below. At the same time, she could see the night sky through meters of stone. There, stars and planets were lined up in ways that only happened once every few hundred years. And in every direction, in sizes that no human language could describe, there were beings that were watching. Beings that lived on time and space scales that were very different from those of humans. Margaret felt her mind growing by leaps and bounds. She was no longer stuck in one place in time. Instead, she was spread out across many different dimensions at once. She saw the past of the Burke estate, watching other seekers do their own rituals, and understanding how each one had added to the work that led up to this moment. She saw possible futures, with consequences that could go in many different directions depending on the choices she made. She also saw alternative presents, or parallel versions of reality where small differences had led to very different results. The voices came back one last time, but this time Margaret knew what they were really saying. They weren't separate beings talking to her. They were echoes of her own expanded mind, bouncing around in loops of time and space. She was talking to herself across time, with future versions of herself guiding past versions of herself. This created a cycle of cause and effect that kept going because it was consistent with itself. The voices didn't choose Margaret Burke. She chose herself, on a level of reality where choice and destiny were two sides of the same coin. The convergence reached its highest point for a moment that could have lasted a second or forever. All of the veils fell apart. Margaret saw the Appalachian Mountains for what they really were. Not geological formations, but structures built on purpose in a time so long ago that people didn't even exist. She saw why they had been built, what they still did, and what secrets they still held. And she saw her part in this much bigger story. She wasn't the main character. She was a thread in a tapestry that was too big for her to fully understand. Margaret was no longer in the central chamber in the same way she had entered as the convergence started to slow down. Her body was still there, but her mind had broken up and spread out through the tunnel network and the mountains, becoming a permanent part of that place. She had finished her last change, moving beyond her own body to become something more permanent and diffuse. Margaret Burke, the Appalachian heiress, had not died or gone missing. Instead, she had become a part of the place itself, a presence that would last as long as the mountains did. She would wait patiently for the next person who would hear the whispering voices in the basement and start their own search for truths that consensual reality would rather keep hidden. After the convergence, that part of the mountains became strangely quiet for many years. The Burke estate was still the same, mysterious and hidden, with plants growing in strange shapes around the old stones that made up its ruins. Some people who passed through the area said they felt strange things, like an inexplicable pull and the need to leave quickly. But no one went in or looked around, as if the place and the world around it had come to a silent agreement. The mansion continued to fall apart naturally, with the walls slowly crumbling under the weight of time and the seasons. However, the basement remained, its entrances partially hidden by rubble and plants, waiting patiently. The tunnels deep down stayed structurally sound in a way that didn't make sense. The chambers kept the symbols carved into their walls, and the crystals stayed in their exact patterns, all frozen in a state of eternal waiting. Some nights, you can still see lights moving around in the trees that surround the old property. Sometimes, sounds come from the depths that sound like music that doesn't belong to any known instrument. Sometimes, though, the air in that part of the mountain seems thicker, as if something unseen were there, watching, remembering, and keeping watch over secrets that were buried so long ago that they have become part of the landscape. Margaret Burke was a very wealthy woman. She inherited a fortune made up of land and lumber mills that spread across the slopes of West Virginia. The property she lived on was secluded, with old oak trees all around it, and the sound of streams flowing down from the mountains all the time. In 1902, rumors about the Burke mansion started to spread through nearby towns. Workers who sometimes worked on the property and promised never to come back spread the rumors. They said that the lady of the house was sick and spent hours alone talking to the void. They also said that she went down to the basement in the middle of the night with lamps that flickered in the cold drafts. At that time, the Appalachian region was a place of contrasts. Rich families lived on huge estates while most people worked in sawmills and mines under harsh conditions. Margaret's husband, who was a powerful figure in the coal mining business, had died a few years before. Since then, she had run an empire by herself, which many people thought was too much for a widow to handle. But Margaret was not weak. She was very careful, planned everything out, and kept the accounting books in order with almost obsessive accuracy. The fact that she was so good at business but still heard voices that scared her was what interested everyone. The staff at the house said strange things were happening. Margaret would suddenly stop talking and turn her head as if she were listening to something far away. After that, she would go down the stairs to the basement without saying anything and stay there for hours. When she came back, her eyes were glazed over and her hands were shaking. People said she wrote things down in notebooks that she kept locked in a mahogany desk, but no one ever got to read what was in those notebooks. The air in the Burke mansion got thicker and thicker, as if something unseen was about to happen. The basement itself was a place that went against the architectural rules of the time. It was carved deep into the living rock of the mountain. It seemed too big for the size of the house. Narrow hallways split off in many directions, with some ending in rusty iron doors that were always locked. Margaret hired workers from faraway counties to build this underground maze shortly after her husband's death. They didn't ask any questions. The project was never officially registered, and the workers who helped build it told different stories about what they found when they dug so deep. Some talked about empty rooms with damp stone walls, while others talked about niches carved into the sides that looked like they were meant to hold something that was never mentioned. Margaret told a distant cousin who came to see her in 1903 that the voices she heard started out as soft whispers that were hard to hear. At first, they were just soft sounds that echoed when she walked by the basement door. As time went on, they became clearer and more urgent. Margaret said they were calls, like someone was calling her down to see something that only she could understand. Her cousin tried to get her to see a doctor, but Margaret strongly refused. She said it wasn't a sickness, it was a revelation. In the depths of that building, there was something her late husband had left undone. Margaret cut herself off from the outside world more and more as the months went by. She canceled plans with friends, stayed away from visitors, and let a lot of the servants go. One old maid stayed behind, either out of loyalty or fear of leaving her boss alone. This woman saw Margaret go down to the basement at night with a lamp and tools like shovels, crowbars, and hammers. There were disturbing sounds coming from the basement, like rhythmic beats that went on until dawn, followed by long, heavy silences. Margaret came out with dirt under her nails and a look on her face that said she had found something terrible, but didn't want to tell anyone about it. People in the area started to think badly of the Burke property. People who were driving by on the main road tried not to look at the mansion, even during the day. People said that strange lights flickered in the basement windows on nights when there was no moon, and if anyone got too close to the property lines, they could hear muffled screams. Several worried neighbors called the county sheriff, but he always came back without being able to get in. Margaret would meet him at the gate and politely but firmly tell him that everything was fine and that he didn't need to do anything. Margaret knew very well that the law couldn't go onto a good person's property without a good reason. The loyal maid finally left the house in 1904. She never said why in public, but people who knew her said she had seen something in the basement that took away all her courage. After that, Margaret was all by herself in the huge, empty rooms and quiet hallways. The business started to lose customers because it wasn't getting the same attention it used to, but the money it had saved up was enough to keep the property running forever. Margaret didn't seem to care about contracts or making money anymore. The only thing she did was work in that cursed basement, listen to those voices that only she could hear, and think about that secret buried under tons of rock and dirt that drove her crazy. In the mountains of West Virginia, the winter of 1905 was very harsh. The paths to the Burke estate were covered in snow, which made the mansion even more isolated. It was already living in its own self-imposed exile. Margaret had changed a lot, but her willpower was still strong. The voices in the basement didn't stop, and she started to answer them out loud, having full conversations with things that no one else could see. The merchants who sometimes brought supplies to the gate saw the change. Hair that was messy, clothes that were dirty, and eyes that seemed to see through people as if they were clear. No one else went inside the house. The delivery was left on the porch, and the next day, payment came in the form of coins counted exactly inside a sealed envelope. Margaret kept this simple routine of staying in touch with the outside world, but it was clear that her mind was elsewhere. People in the nearby villages were always guessing what was going on with that property. Theories grew in churches and taverns. Some people thought Margaret was looking for a treasure her husband had hidden, while others thought she had gone crazy from being alone. Still, others said that supernatural forces had taken over the Appalachian heiress. The basement was still the center of everything. Margaret spent whole days in the middle of that maze-like building, only coming out to get food and water before going back inside. The digging got worse, and the noises coming from below were getting more and more disturbing. It wasn't just the sound of tools hitting rock. There was also heavy dragging, like furniture or other big things were being moved through the narrow halls. And the voices, always the voices, which Margaret swore were as clear as real conversations, telling her where to dig, what to look for, and which wall to knock down. The mansion's structure started to show signs of damage. There were cracks in the walls of the ground floor, which showed that the digging below was weakening the building's foundations. Margaret, on the other hand, didn't care. Her obsession had gone beyond any worries about safety or preserving history. She thought she was close to something big, something that would make all the pain and loneliness worth it. The notebooks she kept locked in her desk grew in number, with pages and pages of handwriting that got worse and worse, diagrams and notes that made no sense, and numbers mixed with broken words. In 1906, something happened that changed how people in the area saw the Burke mansion for good. On a very cold night, bright lights were seen flashing in the basement windows, and a deep, steady sound that sounded like a metallic hum could be heard. Even people who lived miles away said they felt a strange vibration, as if the ground itself were shaking. When dawn broke, the mansion was still completely quiet. One of the chimneys had fallen down, and part of the roof was damaged. Margaret didn't say why or ask for help with the repairs. She just kept doing what she always did, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. People came up with more and more complicated ideas about what Margaret was looking for in the basement. Some people thought that her late husband had hidden documents that could hurt powerful families in the area by showing that he was involved in illegal activities. Some people thought he had built secret rooms to hide money he had made in ways that weren't always legal. But some people thought something worse, that the digging had no real purpose, and that Margaret was following orders from something outside of the living world, something that had chosen her to do something that made no sense. In 1907, the sheriff made one last official attempt because he was worried about the property's obvious decline and the growing number of disturbing rumors. He got permission to look around the mansion by pretending to be concerned about public safety. Margaret met him at the front door and stood in the way. There was a lot of tension in the conversation. She told him that she was in her right mind, that she was fully aware of how to handle her money, and that any interference would result in legal action. The sheriff had to back down because he didn't have any solid proof of a crime or an immediate threat. But before he left, he looked into Margaret's eyes and saw something that scared him deeply. It wasn't crazy. It was absolute conviction. She knew exactly what she was doing. The next few months were marked by an uneasy silence. Deliveries kept coming to the gate, and money came in, but no one saw Margaret. The mansion looked empty, but there were still lights on in the basement windows in the early morning hours. Some brave travelers who got close to the property said they heard strange sounds, a mix of low singing and metallic echoes that seemed to come from deep below the surface. It was strange how the plants around the house started to die, as if something were sucking the life out of the ground itself. There was no going back for Margaret once she crossed a line. The voices that used to whisper now ordered, and she did what they said without thinking. The basement was her whole world, a maze of stone and shadows where she looked for something that might not have existed, or, worse, something that did exist and shouldn't be found. The Appalachian heiress was a prisoner of her own obsession, trapped in an estate that was slowly falling apart around her. The mountains watched in silence as a soul fell into depths that reason could not map. The mountains woke up in the spring of 1908, but the Burke mansion stayed stuck in its never-ending winter. The trees around the property, which should have bloomed with the new season, stayed twisted and dead, with their branches pointing to the sky like fingers pointing at someone. Margaret had become a dark legend, a story that mothers told to show how dangerous it is to be alone and obsessed. But not many people really knew what went on inside those walls, and Margaret liked it that way. The outside world no longer mattered to her. It was just a memory of a life that was no longer hers. The voices in the basement had changed. There were no longer whispers or vague calls. Instead, there were clear instructions telling Margaret what to do. She started making complicated maps on the stone walls with charcoal and paint that she made by mixing dirt and water. The drawings made geometric shapes that didn't follow any known architectural rules. They were spirals that came together at certain points where she focused her digging. Margaret thought she was figuring out a code that her husband had left behind, or maybe something much older than him that had lived in those mountains since the beginning of time. It was clear that Margaret's health was getting worse, but she still had a lot of energy to work in the basement. Her clothes hung loosely on her body because she had lost so much weight, and her skin had turned white from not getting enough sunlight. Still, she kept carrying heavy stones, digging deeper tunnels, and moving rubble with a strength that didn't match her weak appearance. It was as if something outside of her was pushing her to keep going, an outside will that used her body as a tool to reach goals that Margaret didn't fully understand. People who still dared to bring food to the gate started to notice something strange. The coins Margaret left as payment were old, and some were so worn that the faces on them were hard to see. Where did she get them? The Burke family vaults held a lot of money, but these coins looked like they came from times long before the mansion was built. Some people thought Margaret had found a hidden treasure, while others thought she was just spending family heirlooms without caring about their historical value. The truth, as always, was hidden in that cursed property. In 1909, something almost revealed the secrets of the Burke mansion. A hunter who was chasing a wounded deer accidentally went onto the property. As he got closer to the house, he heard something that made him freeze. A woman's voice singing in a language he didn't understand coming from below the ground. The sound was muffled but clear, a repeating and hypnotic tune that seemed to echo through the roots of the trees. The hunter ran away right away, leaving his prey behind and promising never to go back to that spot. When he told the story in the village, people looked at him with serious, understanding eyes. People knew something was wrong at the Burke property, but no one wanted to look into it anymore. Margaret had completely lost track of normal time. Days and nights blurred together in a never-ending cycle of digging and short breaks. She slept in the basement, in a corner where she had made a bed out of old blankets and burlap sacks. In her dreams, she saw endless hallways, rooms full of symbols that glowed with their own light, and people without faces who watched her without saying a word. When she woke up, she couldn't tell what was a dream and what was a memory of her real adventures. The line between reality and hallucination had gotten so thin that it was easy to cross it, like going down another step on the stone stairs. The digging had gone down to a very scary depth. Margaret had dug tunnels that went dozens of meters into the mountain, making an underground network that didn't seem safe at all. The ceilings of the hallways were held up by makeshift wooden beams, but many of them were rotting and could fall at any time. Margaret didn't care that it was dangerous. The voices told her with absolute certainty that she was very close to reaching her final goal. She just had to dig a little deeper, break down another wall, and get to the room that the voices were describing in more and more detail. The notebooks that were locked in the desk grew so many that they couldn't fit in the drawer anymore. Margaret started stacking them in dangerous piles in the basement corners, with frantic notes on every page. Some had lists of things she needed for the digs, while others had strange symbols she had copied from her visions. There were also parts that sounded like conversations, with Margaret writing questions and then giving answers that she said were from voices. Reading those notebooks would be like diving into the broken mind of someone who had given up on consensual reality and moved into a scary universe. The chaos in the basement started to show up in the mansion above it. Furniture covered in dust, torn curtains hanging from broken windows, and dirt from the excavations covering the floors. Margaret only went upstairs when she really had to, and when she did, she looked like a ghostly figure moving through the empty rooms. She talked to herself all the time, answering questions no one else asked, and laughing at jokes no one else told. The Appalachian heiress had become a prisoner of something she had started by choosing to listen to the first whispers. They couldn't be quieted now. They had taken over everything, making Margaret a mere spectator of her own destruction, while the mountains watched and kept their secrets, as they always had. It was very hot in West Virginia in the summer of 1910, but the basement of the Burke mansion stayed cold and damp. Margaret had completely adjusted to living underground. Her pale skin was now stained from the constant dampness, and her eyes were used to the dim light from the oil lamps. She didn't go upstairs very often, and when she did, the sunlight hurt her. like she was a creature that lived at night and was exposed to the day. The voices were all she had left, her only friends, family, and reason for living. Nothing else was real anymore. The excavations uncovered something that altered the trajectory of Margaret's entire fixation. She discovered a wall that wasn't natural in one of the deepest chambers. That surface was smooth, unlike the jagged rock of the mountains. People worked on it a long time ago. For days on end, Margaret looked at every inch of that structure, looking for doors, levers, or any other way to find out what was on the other side. The voices got louder and more frantic, as if something on the other side was also trying to get to her. The tension in that small space was so strong that it felt like there was an electric current running through it. Margaret's hair stood on end all the time. She started using more powerful tools, like heavy hammers that made the tunnel sound like a giant heart beating. Each hit against the smooth wall made a different sound, as if there was an empty space right behind it. Margaret worked with a level of determination that was almost desperation. Her hands were bleeding from doing the same thing over and over again, but the pain didn't matter. She could feel how close she was now. The voices told her to keep going, supported her, and pushed her to do so. There was no going back, no other option. Margaret had spent years of her life on that quest, and the thought of giving up was just not possible. People who lived near the Burke estate noticed that the mood had changed. Animals started to stay away from the area, birds stopped sitting in the trees nearby, and even bugs seemed to be hard to find. It was as if nature itself knew that something strange was going on in that place and left to protect itself. Those who did go near the mansion said it felt oppressive, like an invisible weight that made it hard to breathe and sped up their heartbeats. The property had become a marked place with a border that was invisible but easy to feel. Margaret finally made a hole in the wall. It wasn't delicate work. It was a brutal break that left chunks of stone all over the floor of the room. On the other side, there was a darkness that was thicker than anything she had ever known. It was so dark that it seemed to swallow even the light from the lamp. For the first time in years, Margaret wasn't sure what to do. The voices, which had been so loud, suddenly stopped. The silence was so loud that it was more scary than any sound could be. It felt like something was waiting, watching, and deciding if she was worthy to go on. She walked through the door with the lamp held high in front of her. The room on the other side was much bigger than the ones she had dug up, and it looked like it had been made for a specific purpose. There were carvings on the walls that made patterns that Margaret recognized from her visions, and the drawings she had made in her notebooks. But seeing them there, carved into stone by people we don't know, at a time we can't figure out, was a whole other thing. This was real, solid proof that her obsession wasn't crazy, but rather the discovery of something that other people had known about and kept hidden on purpose. There was a structure in the middle of the room that Margaret couldn't figure out right away. It looked like a well, but the top didn't have an opening. Instead, there was a circular hole in the floor that went down even deeper. Margaret moved slowly toward the opening, which let in a cold breeze that smelled both earthy and metal. The voices came back, but they were different this time. There were many of them, and they were all speaking at once in a language she didn't know but somehow understood. They said this was the place, the meeting point, the door between what was and what could be. Margaret started to spend time in both the newly discovered chamber and the upper levels of the basement. She needed more lamps and ropes to help her explore the bottom of the central shaft. It was even harder for her to go up to the surface, and when she did, she seemed even more out of touch with reality. She spoke in languages other than English, made shapes in the air with her fingers, and smiled at empty corners as if she could see people who weren't there. The change in Margaret Burke was complete. She was no longer an heiress, a businesswoman, or even a real person in the usual sense. She was a tool, a way to connect two worlds that should never meet. Deliveries to the gate stopped in 1911. The merchants had given up, and Margaret didn't try to get in touch with them again. She didn't need to eat as often anymore. Her life had become almost ascetic, supported more by her obsession than by her physical needs. The mansion started to literally fall apart. Beams gave way under the weight of neglect, and tiles fell off, leaving holes that let the rain in. But the basement stayed the same, as if it had been protected from natural decay. Margaret had found her true purpose, and it took over her life, turning her into something that the Appalachian Mountains saw with the ancient and sad silence of those who have seen terrible things before. In the fall of 1912, the mountains were painted with copper and red, but the Burke estate stayed hidden in its own shades of gray and shadow. Margaret had become a part of the basement that was impossible to tell apart from the wet stones and dark hallways that she now knew better than any map could show. She had gone down the central shaft countless times, tying ropes to old beams and letting herself slide to depths that made no sense from a geological point of view. She found more rooms, more symbols, and more proof that something had been in that place long before any human record. The voices were always there, a constant murmur that filled every waking moment and every piece of a dream. Margaret didn't fight them anymore. She had learned to get along with them, understand what they wanted, and follow their advice without question. They took her through tunnels she would never have found on her own, showed her walls where digging had uncovered new paths, and whispered secrets about the place that her human mind could barely understand. Margaret was now exploring an underground world that was separate from the surface world by meters of rock, but connected by something much deeper and more disturbing. The structure of the mansion above kept getting worse and worse. Parts of the building had fallen down, making whole rooms impossible to get to. Stairs creaked dangerously under any weight, and windows without glass let the cold mountain wind whistle through the empty halls. Margaret didn't see this decay very often. The world she knew was below, in the rooms lit by flickering lamps and the tunnels she kept digging, following the voice's orders. The surface was just a distant memory of a life she had lived that now felt like it belonged to someone else. Margaret found something in one of the deepest rooms that made her stop for the first time in months. There was a carving of a person, or something that looked like a person on the stone wall, but the proportions were off. The limbs were too long, and the head was tilted at an angle that no living thing could have. Symbols she had seen many times before made a kind of frame or text around the figure. Margaret carefully wrote everything down in one of her notebooks. Her hands shook, not with fear, but with a kind of religious excitement. This was a message, a story carved into stone by someone who knew something important about that place. The voices got more insistent. It wasn't enough to just explore and write down what they found. Now they wanted them to do things. Margaret had to move some stones around in certain ways, bring things from the surface to certain rooms, and do rituals that involved walking in circles and saying words that the voices told her to say. Even though she didn't fully understand why, Margaret did what she was told. There was a deeper logic to everything, a structure of meaning that went beyond what she could understand. She was just a small part of something much bigger, and realizing this gave her a strange sense of peace. The few people who still remembered the Burke mansion started to notice strange things happening in the area. For example, on moonless nights, lights would dance among the trees near the property, and there were sounds that couldn't be explained by known animals. There was also a constant sense that something was about to happen, like the electrical tension in the air before a storm. But no one came to check it out. The property had a bad reputation that made even the bravest people want to stay far away from it. It was a marked, cursed place where the lines between the natural and the supernatural had become dangerously blurred. Margaret completely lost track of the days and seasons. Her body worked on its own schedule, following the tasks the voices gave it. She slept when she couldn't take it anymore and ate when she thought she might not be able to keep going, but these basic needs started to happen less and less often. It was like she was changing into something else, something that didn't need normal physical limits as much. Her looks showed this change. Skin that was almost see-through, eyes that glowed with their own light in the dark, and movements that were unnaturally smooth, as if she had learned to move in ways that the human body shouldn't be able to. In 1913, Margaret got to the deepest room that the voices had been talking about since the beginning. She didn't get there by digging. She followed a natural path through cracks in the rock that looked like they had been opened on purpose a long time ago. The room was huge, and the ceiling was so high that the light from the lamp couldn't reach it. This made it look like the night sky was below ground. There was a rock formation in the middle that couldn't have been made by nature. It looked like an altar or throne and was covered in layers of crystallized minerals that reflected light in strange ways. Margaret walked up to the main structure with respect. The voices were silent again, but this time the silence was not heavy. It was full of hope. She put her hands on what looked like a cold altar and felt a slight vibration, as if something on the other side was responding to her touch. At that point, Margaret understood something very important. She wasn't finding something new. She was finding something very old again. Others had been to that place before and heard the same voices, walked the same paths, and looked for the same answers. She was just the most recent in a long line of people who had been looking for answers for centuries. They were all driven by the same obsession and changed by the same mystery that lay deep in the mountains. The winter of 1914 brought storms to the mountains that they hadn't seen in decades, but Margaret Burke didn't feel cold or hot anymore. Her body had completely adjusted to the underground environment, working in a way that doctors couldn't understand. She spent whole weeks in the deepest chamber, sitting in front of the crystal structure in a state that was neither fully asleep nor fully awake, but something in between. Margaret could no longer tell where her own thoughts ended and the voices she heard from that old, creepy place began. The voices had become a part of her own thoughts. The property above had been turned into a pile of rubble. The roof had fallen down in a few places, letting rain and snow in without any trouble. The outside walls had big cracks, and the front porch, which used to be nice, was now leaning dangerously to one side. But the basement stayed structurally sound, as if something kept it from falling apart naturally. The tunnels Margaret had dug over the years now made a maze-like network that went hundreds of meters in many directions. Some of them followed natural veins in the rock, while others were clearly dug on purpose to match the patterns the voices had described. Margaret started to understand that she wasn't alone down there. It wasn't that there were other people there. It was that there were other presences. She felt like she was moving through the tunnels. Shadows that didn't match any light source. Cold air drafts that rushed into rooms that weren't ventilated. And sounds that could have been footsteps, dripping, or something else entirely. These people weren't hostile, but they weren't very friendly either. They were there, silently watching her journey. Maybe they were the spirits of other seekers who had come before her and never left that place, even after their bodies died. Margaret's notebooks had become more than just places to write down notes. The pages now had more than just words and pictures on them. They also had stains from things she found in the deepest chambers, like crushed minerals that made strange pigments, liquids that leaked from certain cracks in the rock, and even pieces of crystals that she pressed between the pages like dried flowers. Each notebook had become an artifact in its own right, full of the spirit of that underground place. Flipping through its pages was like touching the mystery that had consumed Margaret for so long. Margaret found a room with things left behind by other people in one of her trips to the oldest tunnels that she didn't dig herself. They weren't old enough to be called historical artifacts, but they weren't new either. There were rusty tools she didn't know the names of, pieces of fabric that fell apart when she touched them, and something that looked like a diary written in a language she couldn't read. Margaret held the diary with respect, knowing that another troubled person had been there, heard the same voices, and walked the same path. What had happened to that person? Had they finished their mission, or had they just disappeared into the depths, swallowed by the same mystery that now consumed her? The voices started talking about something that was about to happen, a convergence that only happened very rarely. Margaret didn't fully get what it meant, but she could feel how important it was to follow the instructions she got. She had to get the main room ready, set up the crystals in certain ways, and put the lamps in places where they would cast certain shadows on the walls. There was a set of steps that had to be followed exactly, as part of a ritual. Margaret worked like crazy, going over every detail again and again, knowing that one small mistake could ruin everything. Anyone who had known Margaret in her previous life would not have recognized her because of how much her body had changed. Her hair had grown long and tangled, and some of the strands felt like they were made of metal. There were patterns on her skin that she didn't remember getting, and they were like the symbols carved into the walls of the chambers. Her pupils were always open, letting in every bit of light, which made her look less than human. She and the place had become one, like the organic and the mineral, the conscious and the ancient. During that winter, people in the far-off villages sometimes had disturbing dreams. They dreamed of tunnels that went on forever, voices calling from impossible depths, and a woman wandering through stone mazes looking for something that shouldn't be found. People who had never met and lived in different villages had the same dreams. They were connected by the fact that they all had the same dream. It was like what was going on at the Burke estate was starting to spill over, leaking out into the outside world through channels that were too small to see or understand. As the voices had told her to, Margaret finally finished getting ready in the central chamber. The crystals were set up to catch and reflect the light from the lamps at certain angles. This made patterns of light on the walls that looked like they were moving and pulsing on their own. The shadows moved in ways that didn't match the flames, as if they were their own beings watching and waiting. Margaret stood in front of the central structure, her hands once more touching the cold surface. The vibration grew stronger until it was almost audible, a deep hum that echoed through her bones. At that point, something very important changed in the room. The air got thicker and had an electric charge that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The voices, which had been many and loud, suddenly came together into one clear, crystalline tone, saying words that Margaret understood perfectly for the first time. They weren't orders or instructions. They were a revelation, an explanation of what that place was like and why all the seekers had come there over the years. The truth was both beautiful and terrifying. It pushed the boundaries of what Margaret thought was possible and made her feel small and insignificant in the face of forces that were beyond human understanding. Margaret stayed in that room for days, maybe even weeks, lost in the moment of revelation. When she finally came out, slowly climbing through the tunnels to the higher levels of the basement, she was different again, not just in her body, but in her very being. She was calm in a way she hadn't been before, as if she had accepted her place in that much bigger story. She now knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just another chapter in a story that had started long before she was born and would go on long after she was gone. The Burke mansion, the Appalachian mountains, and the underground tunnels were all part of a cycle that repeated itself at times that were hard for the human mind to understand. Margaret had become an unwilling guardian of secrets that the surface world didn't want to know. In the spring of 1915, the forests around the Burke estate came back to life, but the estate itself was stuck in its own time, where the seasons didn't matter. After the revelation in the central chamber, Margaret had been coming back to the surface more often, not because she had to, but because she had a new purpose. She started to change the rundown mansion, not to fix it up, but to make it a part of the underground tunnels. Walls were taken down to make direct paths between rooms. Furniture was moved to make certain shapes, and symbols that she had only drawn in the basement before now appeared on the upper walls, either carved with improvised tools or drawn with charcoal and minerals. After that moment of revelation, the voices changed. They were no longer necessary or urgent, but collaborative, as if Margaret had been promoted from servant to partner in that greater goal. They used metaphors of light and shadow, depth and height, and cycles that finished themselves only to start again in new ways to talk to her about ideas that went beyond what people normally say. Margaret had learned to respond not just with words, but also with actions. She made physical representations of the abstract ideas that the voices shared, turning the whole property into a kind of three-dimensional manuscript that held ancient knowledge. The patterns that Margaret made started to change the world around her. Plants that had died would come back to life, but in strange ways, like leaves growing in spirals or flowers blooming in shapes that didn't make sense. Small animals would sometimes come up to the property, drawn by something they couldn't understand. They would walk in circles around the mansion's foundations before running away, looking confused. It was as if the world around the Burke estate was becoming more flexible and open to forces that worked in ways that were different from how things worked in the rest of the world. Margaret started to write down everything with even more care. The notebooks grew in number, each one focusing on a different part of her experience. One for the symbols and their meanings, another for the physical things she saw, a third for the conversations she had with the voices, and several more for the links and patterns she saw between all of these things. Her handwriting had changed over time, adding parts of the old symbols to make a new script that was part English and part something much older. Reading those notebooks would be like trying to figure out a code that changed its rules on every page, like a living language that changed to fit what it was trying to say. On a night when the sky was especially clear, Margaret climbed to what was left of the mansion's second floor and looked at the stars through a hole in the ceiling. The voices taught her how to read celestial patterns of shapes that astronomers of the time didn't know about. They showed her alignments that happened on timescales that were much longer than a single human lifetime. The voices had talked about a convergence that was connected to what happened deep inside the earth and what happened in the sky, both above and below. Everything was connected in a web of correspondences that she was only starting to understand. Now that Margaret had changed, she could do things that were hard to explain. She could move through the dark tunnels without needing light, using either her memory or some other sense she had developed through spending a lot of time there. She could sit still for hours in deep meditation, and her metabolism slowed down so much that her breathing was almost undetectable. And there were times when she seemed to know things she couldn't possibly know, like when storms were coming days before any sign in the sky, or when animals were nearby but out of reach of any normal human sense. Tunnels kept getting bigger, but not just by digging them out. Margaret found passages that seemed to appear out of nowhere, as if the mountain was responding to the patterns she made on the surface. Some of these new passages led to rooms that had clearly never been touched by people and had been kept in perfect condition since the mountains were formed. Margaret found strange and unsettling mineral formations in these chambers. For example, crystals grew at angles that seemed to break the rules of Euclidean geometry, and rock surfaces reflected light in ways that made it hard to see what was really there.